Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm joined by our Foreign Affairs editor, David Pratt. Good evening, David.
Good evening.
We're very grateful to have David join us. We're very grateful to have David involved with the National in general. Over his career, he has achieved so much in the world of foreign reporting, and with so much going on in the Middle East right now, there really isn't anybody better to bring on and chat about it here in Scotland. So, David, how have you been finding the last few weeks?
Well, like everyone else, a mixture of it being hectic, obviously from a work perspective, and obviously, it's sort of bringing back an awful lot of rather sort of traumatic memories in many ways, because I have spent a considerable part of my career covering the the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and a lot of what I'm seeing, I'm afraid, is quite familiar. A lot of what I'm seeing is actually unfamiliar in terms of the levels of intensity and certainly the scale of attacks from both sides. So it's been a kind of bit of a roller coaster couple of weeks for me, as I suspect it has been for many people around the world watching this, and never more so than obviously those directly caught up in it.
Absolutely. So this morning, I put out a call for questions to go to you for people who want to find out more about what's going on. Obviously, we've had some quite big news in the last 24 hours regarding a ceasefire as well. So I have a mix of questions here from people who want to know about your background, who want to know about the political situation in the Middle East. Like, there's a range of things. So I'm going to start with one of the things that I think we get asked most often, especially from younger reporters who are first starting out, maybe writing about what's happening in Palestine, which is, how do you learn about the history of the situation in Palestine? Who are the people to be listening to, and how do you find out what's happened before what's happening right now, if that makes sense? Because it feels like there's so many different people you could listen to on this topic.
Well, I forgive me for reiterating a line, the opening line that I used in my book Intifada, which I had to kind of lay it out very early in the book in terms of positioning. And I said simply that nothing is neutral in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It doesn't matter what you say, what you read, or who you speak to. There will be a position adopted. That's just the default position that so many people adopt when they're talking about this issue. In terms of actually researching the background, short of actually visiting that part of the world itself, there are many authors around. Now, I could pick them at random out of the hat here, both Israeli authors and Palestinian authors. And inevitably certain people will say, oh, that individual's bias or that writer comes from this point of view or whatever. I'm afraid that's the case, and that's unavoidable. That's simply the way it is. But there are certain people, I think, that over the years that I read, certainly when I was a young journalist, and certainly when I was operating in that part of the world and based in Jerusalem for quite a while, I read a lot of Thomas Friedman, who wrote From Beirut to Jerusalem, for current New York Times columnist, and he wrote a fantastic book. Again, it's a position that many people will disagree with. They'll see Friedman's writing as being very pro-Israel or whatever. But in terms of an insight and a background and a history, I think there are a lot of great books by actual novelists as well. I had the privilege of sharing many years ago at the Edinburgh Book Festival, sharing an event with two of Israel's greatest authors and a Palestinian author of considerable repute, the Palestinian being Raja Shahada, and the others being Amos Oz and David Grossman. Sadly, Amos Oz is gone. David Grossman still writes, and his books, again, are fantastic insights, sometimes written through fiction, some non-fiction, I think, insights into the situation. Likewise, Raja Shahada's books themselves are fantastic insights. And I'm steering people in the direction of these books rather than these kind of heavy academic tomes, I think, which many people go to and begin to glaze over after about 10 minutes of reading these books. So I would begin with that. But of course, there's no substitute to actually visiting the area itself and visiting Israel, Palestine. And I think it's an absolute shocker and eye-opener for most people when they do go there for the first time. They go with certain preconceived notions, but to see the actuality of what is going on in terms of this apartheid state, because that's what it is. And I should just mention that, you know, the term apartheid, the term separation in Hebrew is hafrada. It means separation. It was originally used in the context of a kind of divorce, them and us. It was used in terms of relationships. And I was one of the first journalists to use it in the context of the current political situation. And I'd overheard it being used by an Israeli colleague, and I introduced it into a lot of what I was writing. But at that time, to call Israel an apartheid state was verging on an abomination. But as time has gone on, it's become quite apparent that if you actually begin to look at all the component and constituent parts, it's very, very similar to the way South Africa was at the height of apartheid. So visiting the place and reading those kinds of books I've mentioned, I think would be a great introduction.
It's a really interesting point about the language of apartheid, because something that kind of got brushed over last year in a lot of the media really relates to what's happening now, which was that, of course, Amnesty International called the situation apartheid. And the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, said that that wasn't the case. And I thought it was very interesting that Keir Starmer felt more qualified to determine what apartheid would be than Amnesty International. Anyway, I wanted to just touch back on your own trips and your own experiences in Palestine. Can you tell us a little bit about the first time that you went there, and if you experienced something that made you change your mind or just alter how you saw the situation there?
Well, I mean, I first went there on a visit on a kind of freelance assignment way back in the 80s. Obviously, the conflict had been ongoing for a considerable time prior to that. But I was there certainly for the first Intifada, the 87 Intifada. We think of, you could argue that there's been many Intifadas, but the two in modern times were 87 and then around 2000. So I was there in 87. I'd made visits prior to that, but I was there at the outbreak of the first Intifada in 87. And I made regular visits back and forward. I've actually lost count of the number of times I've visited that part of the world. And that includes quite lengthy stays. I mean, I was there at one period for mostly a year and a half consistently, quite often for periods of a year or longer, particularly around the time of the first Gulf War in 1991, when Iraqi Scud's missiles were bearing down on Tel Aviv. I was there then. And I've gone back and forward continuously and saw it through various periods. I've gone back again during the second Intifada in 2000. I managed to track down and interview Marwan Barghouti, who is now in prison, of course, and he's been described as the Middle East Mandela, and is a person who has the ear of the Shabab, as they're known, the boys on the street, the boys and girls on the street who actually conduct the Intifada, and is in jail for his activities, but he was actually on the run when I interviewed him. And in reference to Gaza, I've covered a number of Israel's invasions of Gaza, Operation Cast Lead. They always have these rather dramatic names for their military operations, which I'm told comes out of a lottery. They're not deliberately given in reference to some specific nature of the operation, but actually are drawn at random out of a computer. Very strange. And I was there in 2005 when Israel really disengaged with Gaza. And that was an especially interesting period because you saw the immediate aftermath of the Israeli withdrawal and the power struggle that went on between Fatah, the PLO, Fatah, and Hamas, who have eventually took over in Gaza and remain in control to this day. So I've seen it through that part of the world through many, many ups and downs, mostly those crisis moments, perhaps never more so really in a way until now than in the Gulf War in 1991, because we were looking at a potential much wider conflagration in the Middle East at that period. I should also add that I lived in Beirut next door, which, if you think about it, is actually, it could be the other side of the moon, but is actually only a few hundred miles north of Jerusalem. People forget how comparatively small the scale is there. So I lived and worked there as a young journalist for an English language daily on the news desk at what was then the Beirut Times. And again, I've been back to Lebanon many times when Israel is engaged in war with Lebanon. So it's a long history going back decades, if you like.
And what did you experience like the first time that you went there? What did you observe about Palestine? What did you observe about the Palestinian people?
Well, I think there's two things. I mean, fantastic hospitality always comes to mind. I always find it quite interesting that people that I've spent time with in various parts of the world where they're under, oppression, conflicts, subjected to conflict, are often amongst the most hospitable. I think of the Afghans, the Kurds, the Palestinians. They're very similar in that respect. Fantastic hospitality. But I think it becomes very apparent very quickly, and I refer back to what I was saying earlier, that if you visit that part of the world, you would need to be walking around with a blindfold on not to notice the immediate injustice and the immediate separation and unfairness of what is actually going on. And when I look back to those early days in 87, around the time of the first Intifada, there was still many Palestinians coming from Gaza and working in Israel at that time. Of course, it all changed with the so-called separation barrier, which Israel introduced, cutting off the West Bank and then closing down Gaza after its withdrawal in 2005. But, it stares you in the face at every turn, the levels of, frankly, injustice, the levels of separation. These are references which, again, are straight out of the apartheid South Africa playbook. Pass laws, restrictions on movement. The term Bantustan, which was used in South Africa, of course. Ariel Sharon commissioned people to visit South Africa and actually use the template. This is historical facts, not my opinion. You can check this. Visited South Africa and used a lot of the templates that the apartheid regime were using there in South Africa to introduce them into Israel itself, even right down to the uniforms of the Israeli police on the streets bear a strong resemblance to the South African police of the apartheid era. So long before the term was being bandied around, the component and constituent parts of apartheid were being introduced in that part of the world. So the injustice is the first thing, the immediate visual sense of a them and us scenario.
I just want to say hello to Gregor and June, who have messaged on YouTube to say that they're watching and hopefully learning a lot from you, David. I never knew that about South Africa, so that's really very interesting, especially about the uniforms. One of the things that I have found speaking to younger people, especially for whom maybe this is a really, really significant moment in sort of global affairs for them, maybe they don't remember Iraq or possibly weren't actually born when that happened. How significant is this specific moment now?
I think it's of enormous significance, and there are lots of parallels. I've been writing in the National over the last weeks, in part about certain similarities with Iraq. I'll say a bit more about that in a second, but just referring to what you're talking about, the level of significance. I don't remember in the decades, and we're talking about 30 odd years and more, 40 years. I don't remember a moment quite as profound as this, specifically in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And for a moment there, in the last week or two, we were looking really at what many were worried would actually escalate into a wider war in the Middle East. I wouldn't say that we're out of danger yet from that. I mean, this is early days in this conflict, and we have this pause and the possible release of the hostages, but we're way from out of danger in terms of a potential escalation. Even if the suggestions from Tehran and from elsewhere is that there was no intention of escalating this, but you can never take things at face value in the Middle East. It's complex in that way, but I do think it is a profound moment. I think it's a moment that is profound not just for the Palestinians, but profound for Israelis. It's interesting that everyone's paying attention to what's going on now in Gaza, but actually for months in advance of that, I was also writing about the kind of political turmoil that was gripping Israel itself and saw Benjamin Netanyahu's government under tremendous pressure. And I think it's inextricably connected with Netanyahu's problems. Going back to Iraq, I think the parallels are obvious insofar as that Israel has no end game other than the evisceration of Hamas here. It is not thought through partly clouded by rage, partly clouded by the comparative immediacy of its military operation. It has not thought through the post-conflict scenario. And goodness knows we know what that resulted in, not just in Iraq, but in other parts of the world, post-Arab Spring, for example, in Libya also. So, no one has thought through the post-politics here. And I think, many of the commentators in the Israeli press in Haaretz, the daily newspaper, which has been outstanding, and I can't encourage people enough to read that newspaper in terms of getting a viewpoint from Israel, which many people might be very surprised about. But yes, the parallels with Iraq are there, and it is a very, very dangerous moment. We're not out of the woods yet.
There's a really great question from Stuart K. Brown in the chat, but I'm going to ask you something because you touched on something about domestic politics. And then, Stuart, I'll go back to your question because that is really very interesting. But yeah, because you touched on the domestic political situation in Israel, actually, I spoke to our reporting team earlier and I asked if there was anything that they would like me to ask you. And one of our reporters was asking for a bit of an overview of both the domestic political situation in Israel and Palestine in the run-up to October 7th. So it would be very helpful if you could give us an insight into that.
Well, let me take the Palestinian side first. Things were actually comparatively quiet in Gaza. I mean, eerily quiet, looking back in retrospect to October the 7th. Things were bubbling in the West Bank because we saw Israeli incursions into a number of West Bank towns, particularly in Jenin, Tulkarm, which has been a subject of raids today also, and in other parts of the West Bank itself. But in Israel itself, Israel proper itself, there was tremendous turmoil. We had millions of people on the streets, provoked primarily by kind of constitutional issues, and particularly what was known as a judicial coup by Netanyahu's government, whereby they were tailoring the Supreme Court's capacity to work freely, unhindered by political constraints. And many people in Israel, many Israelis, felt that this was really pressing in on their democracy. It was a step too far by Netanyahu's racist, frankly, and very right-wing components within his government, and obviously took to the streets. But I think Netanyahu, the great political survivor that he is, saw this as an opportunity to just dig down deeply and didn't want to jeopardize his coalition, so played game with these rather unsavory elements within his coalition government. And what's especially interesting here is I think it basically blindsided Netanyahu and the government to what was looming in Gaza. I think, again, it's very interesting if you read the reports in Haaretz that senior Israeli military people felt that there was stuff coming out, warnings that something was coming from Gaza, but Netanyahu chose to throw it in the trash can, those reports. The papers in Israel today are dealing with that very issue. You've also got to remember there are an awful lot of people that were opposed to Netanyahu and his judicial coup were people within the armed forces, senior members of the Israeli security and military establishment, Shin Bet, the internal security service, the Mossad, the external security service, which is a bit like our MI5 and MI6, and then the Israeli Defense Forces, Air Force, and Navy itself. Many of the senior figures in those positions within the services, and indeed former people like Ehud Barak, no slouch when it comes to war heroism, if I can put it that way, and being esteemed in the ranks of the Israeli military, were very critical of him. So, it set up this incredible tension between the people and indeed within the military establishment. And it now appears that there were by Israeli that Netanyahu chose to ignore because he was mostly concerned with dealing with his own domestic political situation. Can I just add to this, Laura, that during one of my last visits to Jerusalem, I interviewed a number of people and met with a number of people, Israelis, I should stress, two of whom were actually former Israeli ambassadors to South Africa and had fought, were veterans of the 6-Day War. So again, people that were not prone to being sympathetic to the Palestinians and remain that way. But one of the things they said to me was, listen, David, it would be as long as that was something they said to me 2 years in advance of what happened with the judicial coup. So the writing was on the wall very early on. Seekers within the establishment knew coming great the domestic problem that Netanyahu faces. I should add the people who said that was actually a former advisor of Netanyahu as well. So yeah, it's a place that the problems were looming domestically, and I think they've committed a not
I think we've lost you a little bit there, David. I think it's your Wi-Fi may be going in and out.
Nope. Here. Can you hear me?
You're back.
Yep.
Yes, I can hear you now.
That's great. Yeah. Okay.
We lost a little bit of that last bit, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying.
Okay.
Stuart Kerr Brown on YouTube has a really interesting question, which is that he'd like to know why the media don't ask the obvious question in response to when it's stated that Israel has the right to defend itself. How does Palestine defend itself?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Israel does have the right to defend itself, but defending yourself in an occupation are two entirely different things, you know. And Palestine does have the right to defend itself, and that's happening. Unfortunately, it happens through, to a great extent, through the auspices of people like Hamas. You know, Hamas is a real dilemma for many people. You know, they're branded as terrorists, but in actual fact, you know, they were elected both in Gaza and indeed in elections prior to the Gaza elections going back into the noughties and the period just after the Intifada. You know, these were internationally monitored elections, and Hamas came through. They beat Fatah in those elections, and the results were sort of, shall we say, ignored by the West. And can I just say that friends of mine in the past have always said, you know, the big problem with Western democracy, David, and it's applied to the Middle East, is that when we have Western democracy, if the results don't turn out the way the West likes them, there's a tendency just to ignore the results and ride roughshod over them. And I think that's what the West does. It's done it over this part of the world. It did it after the Arab Spring in parts of elsewhere in the Middle East as well. So, you know, we constantly preach to the Arab world about democracy and then ignore the results of the democracy when people vote for people that we don't agree with. Hezbollah is another point in case in Lebanon. I mean, they have a presence on the government there. But yes, to answer the question specifically, Palestinians, I believe, do have a right to defend themselves. But, you know, all have rules. I don't see much evidence anywhere in the world. Absolutely paramount. The problem is that, you know, Israel has a right to defend itself. It's doing so from a position of occupation, illegal occupation. And that is the fundamental problem there. Plus the complexion of who is carrying out the aggression in the nature of Hamas as an Islamist group, or in the case of Israel, at the behest of some very right-wing people. Let's be honest, this. It's not just the IDF involved in this. You know, the West Bank at the moment is subjected to considerable violence by settlers and by what are organized militias working at the moment. So able to defend themselves, albeit with very limited means. Can you hear me, Laura?
Yes, I heard it there. You just froze again slightly, but I think it's okay. It's going in and out a little bit, but I think we'll stick with it for now, and we should be all right. That was really very interesting, and I'm sure Stuart will be very grateful for that answer. I want to talk a little bit about the news from the last 24 hours, which is this ceasefire, not quite ceasefire, pause in the fighting. A few of us were interested. What will happen after these 4 days? And is there any chance of a lasting ceasefire being achieved?
Well, frankly, what will happen after these next 4 days or so is any less, you know, I think the Israelis have made it quite clear that they've no intentions of stopping their military operation. So we can expect that military operation to continue without a doubt. Whether there's a lasting ceasefire or not, I think is still up for grabs. And much of that will very much depend on who's brokering that ceasefire. Obviously, the role of Qatar at the moment, which plays a very strange role of kind of accommodating Hamas leaders and at the same time working and talking very closely with Israel. Much will depend on the kinds of pressure that they bring to bear and that the West brings to bear as well, particularly the United States. But I think Israel's military operation will continue. Continue to what ends. I have this horrible suspicion that, certainly the hard right within Israel, police for Palestinians being booted over the border into Egypt, where what you would have is tented cities, which would then become sort of fixed towns and cities. If you think of Lebanon post 82 after the Israeli invasion, that's precisely what happened. Palestinians fled to Lebanon. They lived in tents. Those tents became refugee camps, became settlements. Emerged Hezbollah and other gunmen and Palestinians who continued the struggle. So, if the Israelis are intent in booting everyone out of Gaza, God forbid, and leaving them in Egypt, that's the likelihood of war. But of course, Egypt would not want that because they have on their doorstep in the same way that Lebanon had in 82. I think, we'll see this pause. I think hostages will be exchanged because I think it will do Hamas's credibility some good to be able to extract something from Israel in terms of the hundreds of prisoners that it will get out of Israeli jails as a result of that. But then I fear it will go back to business as usual and the fighting will continue. And the longer term military operation will be prosecuted to whatever ends Netanyahu and his cohorts have in mind.
One of the questions we got on Twitter actually was, why are there so many Palestinians held in Israeli jails?
Well, that's because they've been struggling for a very, very long time. It's a combination of that, and it's a combination of something we referred to earlier, whereby Israel's security apparatus and the kinds of regulations, rules, and crackdowns that Palestinians face mean that they can be arrested on a virtual whim in the West Bank in particular and in East Jerusalem. So it is very straightforward for people to be arrested for what is perceived to be activity, even if that activity is comparatively benign. Obviously, there are those in Israeli jails that are there for reasons that they've been actively engaged in violent activity. But there are many people there that are simply picked up off the street. I would defy anyone to walk the streets of East Jerusalem right now or on any day, any time, and not see Palestinians A, being stopped in the streets, B, being arrested for what could be, I don't know, a word to some police officers or some slight that's perceived. Let me just tell you a brief anecdote. When I lived in Jerusalem, I lived not far from the Green Line between East and West Jerusalem, and I used to drink in a bar actually up in just over the Green Line in West Jerusalem, which was up near an area called the Russian Compound, and there was a central jail there where most of the Palestinians picked up off the streets were taken to those jails, and you could literally look out the bar window and literally every other 20 minutes or so, there would be vans pulling up with Palestinians that had been arrested off the streets for whatever reason, not carrying an ID card, being in the wrong area, looking suspicious, you name it, whatever. And equally, you could actually, on a quiet night, listen to the screams, I kid you not, from that same jail as people were being subjected to what I presume was interrogation. I've written about that, so it's common knowledge. So there are many people in Israeli jails, not just adult males, but obviously children who've been involved in stone throwing. The first Intifada was often known as the War of the Stones. So, they weren't fully armed and were chucking stones at cars. So many of them were picked up at that time. And of course, there are women activists who have been picked up as well. And as the crackdown increases in East Jerusalem and in the Old City, particularly along the Silwan Valley area, which I visited many times, which is close to a small place called Megiddo. I don't know if people are aware of this, but the word Armageddon comes from the word Megiddo, the end of days, because most Orthodox Jews believe that the state of Israel doesn't exist until the end of days and the Messiah returns and creates the state of Israel. That's, by the way, why so many Orthodox will not do national service and do not pay taxes, because they don't believe that the state of Israel as it currently exists until the end of days. So that area around the Silwan Valley is particularly subjected as settlements expand there and more people are arrested. So there's many reasons why the jails are full, and full they are.
That's really interesting, and I can't even imagine hearing the sounds of people screaming like that. I know you've worked in sort of conflict zones for so long, David. You say it so kind of casually, because I'm sure you've experienced much worse, but to me that's really shocking. And I would like to ask you more about your experiences on the ground in sort of war zones and conflict zones a little bit later. I wanted to touch on the International Criminal Court. There's been a lot of talk about Israel violating the ICC. What are the actual consequences of doing that? Do you have any examples? And are there just sort of international laws that you're not supposed to break, but you can break them and basically get away with them?
Well, I think there's two things. I mean, I would be the last person to criticize the International Criminal Court, because I think, we need it. The fact that it remains a bit of a paper tiger or a bit toothless is a result of geopolitics, in the same way that the United Nations suffers, because basically the big players, the big beasts, if you like, around the table in the Security Council call the shots. And I think it's much the same with the International Criminal Court. Many people don't sign up to it. And some of the biggest perpetrators of war crimes or whatever are not signatories to it, And even when, they are those signatories, and when people are brought before it, it is very difficult to get convictions as such, And it's particularly difficult for, I think, to bring convictions against countries like Israel when they have, shall we say, the support and the allies, strong allies at the UN and countries like the United States or whatever. It's very difficult. And in that sense, I would like to see the International Criminal Court have more teeth. Not just in Israel, I hasten to add. We see it a lot in Africa, where many sort of authoritarian regimes and despots there. Sudan is an example right now as we speak, where many of these people should be coming before the International Criminal Court. But getting these people physically, arresting them, bringing to the court is problematic enough. Having the evidence then to prosecute against them, and let's be honest about this. Who do you begin with and who do you end with? I mean, it's not the first time I've heard people say that Tony Blair should have been brought before the International Criminal Court, or that George W. Bush should have been brought before the International Criminal Court, or some other American president or European leader, and we have others like, like Vladimir Putin at the moment, The mechanisms to do that are incredibly complex and very difficult. But that doesn't mean to say that A, we shouldn't support it, B, be supportive of trying to give it more clout, more teeth, more tenacity to be able to do its job. And if that were the case, I think Netanyahu would find himself, along with many others, fair square in the dock.
That's really fascinating. I'm going to touch back on your own experience, David. Obviously, there's such a need for journalists in war zones. I've felt extremely emotional watching the testimony of particularly female journalists on the ground in Gaza. I know you shared something on Twitter the other day, which was talking to the female journalists on the ground. And I was fully just crying watching it, because I can't even imagine what it's like to be there and to have that pressure and that responsibility, that sense of duty. What kind of feelings do you have as a reporter on the ground in a war zone? How do you separate your own need to survive from the need to report on these terrible atrocities that are happening?
Well, I think the first thing I would say in response to that, and obviously what's happening in Gaza is a point in case, is that foreign correspondents choose to be there, and they can come and they can leave when they want to. I mean that's an important distinction between many of my colleagues that are within the indigenous journalists, if I can call them that, the local journalists who operate in Iraq or Afghanistan or Gaza, whatever the case may be. Their families are there, they're tied up, they live there. Reporting what's happening around them brings a different set of responsibilities. We've seen that in Gaza, where people are trying to get their own families to safety and report simultaneously. I think the most important thing, is that I previously worked for the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, and we worked really primarily to help build independent media in countries that are either suffering conflict or in post-conflict scenarios. And that is vitally important, to have these independent reporters on the ground. And frankly, without them, we would be blind to what is going on in Gaza right now, because the access is incredibly limited. Again, to mention what people might not be aware of, even on a day-to-day basis, if you're working as a reporter in the West Bank or in Israel, the Israelis have what's called, or used to be able to introduce, at the snap of a finger, something called a closed military zone order. So if I'm standing in Bethlehem interviewing someone and they decide that, hey, this area is now a closed military zone, that's it. They just wave this document in front of my face, as they did during the Intifada many times, and you are obliged then to leave that closed military zone. You have no choice other than to do so. Otherwise, your press credentials will be rescinded, and your chances of you getting another press card to operate, without which is impossible to operate in Israel, the chances of that are very remote indeed. So there are whole kinds of constraints and restrictions on you operating in that part of the world. And Gaza, especially, given that there's a military operation ongoing, we've seen one or two journalists from outside going in, mainly TV crews, and being kind of led round in very orchestrated and organized visits, which is really difficult to tell what's true and what's not true there. So really the eyewitness reporting has been done by our very courageous Gaza reporters and Palestinians on the ground. As for me working on the ground as a reporter, I've got to remember constantly that, I'm there to do a very specific job, and I'm there really in many ways as a guest of people in that country. It's a tremendous intrusion to actually not just visit a country, but to walk in on people's lives when they're undergoing on a day-to-day basis tremendous trauma. It's a huge imposition, particularly as a photographer, to stick a camera on someone's nose when they've just undergone great loss, great pain, great hardship, great suffering. And it's vitally important, I think, that reporters recognize that. I'm a passionate believer in eyewitness reporting, Laura. I mean, my entire career has been based on it. And I fear desperately the day that when that eyewitness reporting is either prevented, no access, no story, the world does not see. Eyewitness reporting is vital. There's no substitute for being on the ground, and governments know that. And the Israelis especially are very adept at making that very difficult for journalists, and in other parts of the world too. We pose a threat potentially like we've never posed a threat before, and that threat is of truth-telling.
That's really true. Are you speaking to anybody on the ground there at the moment, David? Have you had contact?
I keep in touch with like almost everywhere that these things are ongoing. Indeed, I would have been there in Israel myself. I have a number of reasons. People might be curious about that as to why I'm not there at the moment. One is that actually there's no access to Gaza, so I'd be joining the phalanxes of TV crews twiddling their thumbs, frankly. The only serious reporting that's being done from inside at the moment is anything that may have to do with, from inside Israel, is anything to do that may have to do with the domestic political situation. And what's been largely ignored, and if I was there at the moment, what I would be looking at is what is happening in the West Bank, because I believe the West Bank is underreported, again, partly because of restrictions, but also underreported simply because Gaza has overshadowed it in that way. But make no mistake, what's happening in the West Bank has the potential to be just as explosive, if not more so, than what's happening in Gaza. And in many ways, it's more representative of the plight of the Palestinians on a wider level, because the Palestinian Authority, which controls about 40% of the West Bank, is really fallen out of favor with the vast majority of Palestinians. And Palestinians, by and large, are young people. It's a young demographic, whereas the old guard, as they're known within the Palestinian movement, the old Fatah guard, like Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, are not liked by the vast majority of Palestinians. They're seen to be doing Israel's bidding, and they have fallen out of favor. Thus, it allows many, many other groups to emerge there. So if I was reporting on the ground, that's what I would be looking at, the threats within the West Bank and indeed the wider conflict to the north in Lebanon. And don't rule out me going yet. The other reason I'm not there is, I think, as you're aware, that I have a major retrospective exhibition of my war photography looming in Geneva, and I've been really tied up with working on that. But other than that, I'd be there, just as I've been in Ukraine regularly over the last 2 years now.
Absolutely. I've got a couple of comments I'd like to read to you. One is from YouTube saying, please thank David. I value his observations and journalism in the highest esteem. Me too, David. Honestly, you give us such great insight, regardless of where you're covering in the world. And we always look forward to reading your pieces, which go in the newspaper on a Thursday and a Sunday. And there's also a comment from Sammy who's saying he thought international law protected journalists from being blocked from reporting the facts. And I think this is in relation.
Oh, if only that were the case. If only that were the case.
And I think you were really referring to the fact that there's no access to Gaza for international journalists. Ultimately, it is up to Israel whether people can go in or not, right? So that's...
It is. I mean, number one, if you arrive in the country, you would have to, if you don't already have, even if you carry an international press card, which I do, I would then have to apply, as every journalist does, for local accreditation, which goes through a vetting procedure, not like it did in the early days when I was there in the 80s. When I first went, it went through a place called Beit Agron in Jerusalem, which was kind of run by the military and civilian administration combined. It actually goes through the military now, your press accreditation, and wow. you can imagine. There is another aspect to this as well, which is if you write unfavorably, I'm going to be very candid here. Over the years, if you write unfavorably about what is going on in that part of the world, it can make life very, very difficult for you in terms of getting these sorts of accreditation processed swiftly and efficiently. That has happened to colleagues that I know in the past, not because they hold any particular political views, but simply because they have written stuff that is deemed to be sort of controversial or doesn't chime with the regime. And I should say that that's not strictly to do with Israel, that you encounter that in many parts of the world. You might encounter that in parts of Ukraine. You would certainly encounter it in Russia. You would encounter it in certain parts of Africa or in Iraq or whatever. So these are problems that journalists have to deal with all the time. We can't just roll up there and there's an automatic assumption that international law protects us. I think the opposite is true. I think, as I said, journalists have become greater targets. I think back to my time back in the days in the Bosnian War, when journalists, at one point, there was actually a bounty put in the head of journalists, and snipers on a certain side were getting, X number of $100 for every journalist that they could kill. It's not quite like that openly in that way, but I think we do face threats like we've never done before. Hence, many news organizations now insist on, particularly the major broadcast organizations, on journalists doing so-called hostile environment training before they're dispatched to hostile environments and war zones.
Yeah, it makes sense because it is such unbelievably dangerous work. And as I say, we're very grateful for that work that you do. And last year, you know, when you spent quite a lot of time out in Ukraine, you offered a lot of insight that was very valuable to those of us trying to follow it from home and not necessarily sure where to get all of our information from. And I feel like you cover these international situations with such great kind of reason and care. And yeah, we're always so pleased to have you.
I think, Laura, people have to be. I mean, we have to be careful where we look for our information. It's like, you know, the warnings that everyone gets about the internet. Everything's there. It's just knowing where to look for it and knowing how to cross-check it and that sort of thing. It's a bit like basic on-the-ground reporting itself. It's important to corroborate stuff. It's important to make sure that, you know, that both sides are represented. You know, that does not mean to say that that all journalism. I'm not a believer in the journalism of impartiality necessarily. I think some of the finest journalism in history has been written from a very partial perspective. We mentioned South Africa earlier on in the apartheid era. Some fine journalism came out of there that actually was very anti-apartheid. You know, you look back to the Vietnam War. Likewise, some of the finest journalism there was produced by people who were came from a particular political perspective. So, you know, journalism does not necessarily need to be this utterly impartial thing that it's meant to be. I don't believe that for a moment.
Well, we are, of course, speaking on the platform of the national newspaper, which has a very obvious position, and it's on our front page. And I'm very proud to work for a newspaper that has a position, and I'm also proud that it's transparent about it, and everybody knows where we're reporting from. And I would sort of challenge people who accuse us of being impartial to go and find me a newspaper that's completely impartial on the news.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But we could probably.
I mean, one of the things that listeners should be aware of actually is that, you know, when many journalists are actually asked to speak on political platforms, even if they feel very strongly about that, one of the reasons that they don't is that, you know, it may very well be that they have to work in a certain country subsequently, and that to join certain political platforms may mean that they're deemed by that country to be undesirable and not worthy of having press accreditation, which would suit that country, wherever that country might be, very, very aptly, because it means that they don't have to worry about that journalist coming in to report on things on the ground. So I think listeners should be aware of those kind of difficulties that particularly freelance journalists have when they enter parts of the world.
Definitely. Well, I'm sure we could have another discussion about impartiality, and that would probably take up another 45 minutes of our time.
I'm sure.
I'm sure we have lots of interesting opinions on that. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight, David. It is very appreciated. And I'm sure that our reporting team will be watching this as well, because they had a lot of questions when they're reporting and they're getting different information from different sources. So it's extremely valuable to us. If you enjoyed this chat with David, you'll be able to watch it back if you didn't catch the whole thing. You'll be able to see the full clip on our Twitter, on our Facebook, and on YouTube. And it's also embedded in a story on our website. So if you go straight to the site, you'll be able to have a look. And I'll see if I have time, I'll turn it into a podcast as well. But I'm not making any promises right now. It's a busy week. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And I'm sure David will be back with us soon to discuss the latest developments. Thank you so much, David.
My pleasure, Laura.